Welcome to a special edition of History's Remnants, where we are saluting a colorful character that represents the swinging spirit of the Roaring Twenties. Looking for a strong woman that takes no crap? Look no further than Dirty Helen. Although Helen was born in 1886 and raised by a comfortably wealthy family in the suburbs of Indianapolis, a chain of events changed her life and led her to a life filled with colorful characters like bank robbers, bootleggers, and Al Capone. As a teenager, she met and fell in love with the handsome new boy in town, Phil Capel. Despite her parents' urging, she dated him in secret, and after completing high school and a semester of college, she ran off to Cincinnati to be with him. Phil and Helen were married, and they stayed with his family as Phil worked in a bar and they started their family. Helen soon became bored and got a job in clothing sales, a job that got her out of the house and kept her in fine clothing, a weakness that she would have for the rest of her life. Phil and Helen's first son, Phil Jr., came, and Helen gave up her job to take care of him. Time passed, and Helen again bored of being a housewife and got another job selling clothing. She enjoyed her work, and it helped her feel fulfilled. Things were not all right at home, though. Phil spent many late nights at the bar, and Helen soon found out that he was having an affair with a prostitute. She confronted the other woman at her apartment, and when the woman told her to step aside because her husband no longer loved her, Helen snapped. She raked her nails down the woman's face and cleavage, and the woman was knocked down the stairs. Helen then entered the woman's apartment and had her scorned revenge by tearing the curtains from the windows and pouring wine over the fine sofa. On the way out, she grabbed a framed photo of her husband and stepped over the unconscious body of the other woman, stopping only to take a diamond ring from the woman's hand that the woman had bragged was a present from Phil. Helen was heavily pregnant at the time, and despite the initial request for a divorce, she tried to make her marriage work. She again gave up her job to raise her sons and be a good wife, but her husband went back to his late nights and often didn't come home at all. When she resigned that Phil wasn't going to return to be a faithful husband, she went back to work again. She could have continued that way, a wife who lets her husband cheat while she runs the house as if nothing were wrong, but something happened that changed her life. Her friend from work suggested that they go on a double date with a couple of guys that she knew that were visiting from out of town. Helen reluctantly accepted, but she was conflicted. Phil may have no qualms about breaking their wedding vows, but they still meant something to Helen. Helen took the afternoon off work and went to Phil's bar. She asked him to come back home and be faithful, and when he said that the marriage was too broken, she begged not to make her go on that night's date. He turned away from her, and she was left to wander out of the bar on her own. From the shadow of a nearby shop's entryway, she mourned her broken marriage and watched as Phil walked out to a cab with the other woman inside. In that moment, something changed for Helen. Her mind was settled, and she started preparing for her date. Helen arrived for her date with new lipstick and perfume and wearing a new suit. The two couples had dinner at a bar where Phil and his friends were known to hang out, and sure enough, Phil was there with the other woman. Helen turned her focus to the others in her party, drinking too much and laughing loudly. The next time she turned back, the pair was gone. After dinner, Helen went back to her date's hotel room and broke her wedding vows. She awoke the next morning to find her date still asleep and money left by her hat. She dressed and took the money when she left. She was on her first step to being the new Helen. She divorced Phil, but she didn't return to her parents because her father had disowned her when she had run off with Phil. At that time, Cincinnati's divorce laws gave daughters to mothers and sons to fathers, but Helen couldn't bear to part with both of her children. She left Phil Jr. with Phil and took 7-year-old Donnie west. Not knowing where to go, Helen and Donnie took a train to Chicago, the hub to anywhere in the country. She shopped at the famous Marshall Fields, where she traded in her black morning hat for something bright and colorful. They then continued on their way to their newly chosen destination, Tucson, Arizona. Once there, they checked into a hotel, and while Donnie napped, Helen went to the hotel bar. In the bar, she noticed a man that she had seen before, a man whom she had sold a suit for his wife and had since seen his pictures in the newspapers attached to articles about a bank robbery in Chicago. The man, who Helen called Eddie, approached Helen, not recognizing her at first. But when Helen introduced herself, Eddie was ecstatic. He explained that he was in hiding, although he didn't directly admit to the bank robbery, and said that he needed to return to his mountain hideout where he would be staying until the 1st of September. Would she come and keep him company? Upon her hesitation, Eddie offered to pay 4 years' worth of Donnie's tuition for school and summer camp, as well as some extra for Helen herself for just a few months of her companionship at his lonely hideout. Helen accepted, and after getting Donnie situated in his new school, she joined Eddie for 5 months at his isolated fishing cabin in the mountains near Denver. After the cabin, Helen moved to San Francisco, where she met a lumber baron that she called Harold. After an evening of fun, Harold asked Helen to be his personal secretary, but there was one small problem. Helen still needed to take a secretarial course. He paid for the 90-day course, and when she was done, she joined him in Canada to be his secretary. Her time in Canada was miserable, with the cold weather and Harold's jealousy that kept her away from other men. He asked her multiple times to marry him, but she never accepted. When World War I broke out, Helen devised a plan to serve the nation the best way she could. She took leave from Harold to go on a shopping trip, but instead, she lied her way onto an army camp and into the officers' club, where she entertained the gentlemen for a week. When she returned to Canada, she informed Harold that after 3 years she was quitting and had had enough of it. Helen collected Donnie from his boys' school, and they moved to New York, where Helen got a job selling hats by day and did bedroom business at night. It is here where Helen met Bob. Bob was a younger man that fought in the war and had been suffering breathing fits after inhaling mustard gas. But Helen was in love. They married and moved to Chicago, where his family lived and life was good. Bob joined his family rug business, selling to many rich and well-connected people. His clients included mobster Big Jim Colosimo, and Helen got to dine with the likes of Big Jim, Southside mob boss Johnny Torrio, and Al Capone. On February 8, 1923, Bob's health got the better of him, and he passed away, leaving Helen miserable. After a few months, she got another job in sales at a clothing store and started her bedroom business again. The story behind her third husband is less than romantic. One evening, while out on a date, a friend pulled Helen to the side and told her that the date had a nasty habit of getting his dates arrested for being immoral. Helen schemed a way to cook his goose. When the evening was coming to an end, the date walked Helen to her door. Helen opened her door enough so that he could see all of her fine furnishings that were left to her when her husband passed. But when the date asked to enter, she feigned innocence. After a short courtship, the couple was married, and despite her new husband wanting to live in her apartment, Helen said she just couldn't live there with him, as it had been her home with her previous husband. Things quickly turned sour, and they fought bitterly. When Helen demanded a divorce, she made 2 phone calls, one to her lawyer and the other to her buddy Al. On the day of the divorce hearing, Helen showed up on Capone's arm, and the trial went quickly with her now ex-husband accepting things on Helen's terms and leaving town shortly after. In 1925, Helen received a call from a friend. Al Capone was asking for a favor. They met for drinks, and Al explained that someone had been shorting him at one of his whorehouses, and he needed her to check on it. Her job would be to collect the cash and watch the clock. Helen accepted the job for the night, working 8 hours in the dingy place, and when she met with Capone the next day, he declared the money she handed him was more than he ever saw from an 8-hour shift, especially a weeknight. They agreed Helen would work a second night just to make sure it wasn't a fluke, and sure enough, the take was again higher than usual. The suspected madam was fired and literally kicked out on her ass. Helen decided to open her own business, but she didn't want to horn in on the mob's territory. Under Capone's recommendation, she moved to Superior, Wisconsin, a booming town because of the ore boat trade. She renovated a house and, thanks to a kind policeman, found 2 of the most beautiful girls in the area. When opening day came, she borrowed a car from the local dealership and hired the owner's son to drive her around town. Clothed in a flashy beaded and fur-trimmed dress and hat, she sat in back, throwing out $100 bills, proclaiming, "Have a drink on Helen at 510 John Street." Prohibition was in full effect, and Helen had 2 bedrooms upstairs for her girls and a bar on the main floor. She paid off the local officials, so she never had any trouble. One evening, she was tending bar when a handsome stranger entered. They chatted and he flirted, but Helen assured him she wasn't for hire. He complimented her booze and asked where she got it from. "From Art Miller," she responded, and he asked if she knew him. "No," she replied. When it was his turn to go upstairs, Helen's girl came running back downstairs. "Helen, that guy has a gun. I'm afraid of him." Helen assured her that the gun wasn't for her and to get back up there, but the man was already coming back downstairs. He gave the girl some money and sat back with Helen. "I'm much more interested in you than what's upstairs," he said. The man asked Helen if there was somewhere they could get some privacy, and she took him to a back room to wait while she finished working. When she returned to him, he was asleep in a chair. He startled awake and realized that he had been there for 4 hours. "What do I owe you?" he asked. She brushed away his offers to pay, and he said, "I think I like you, Helen." "Well, I like you too. What's your name?" "Art Miller." He was not only her source for booze, but a hijacker, crook, and pimp. Their courtship consisted of a couple days of phone calls just to say hello and culminated with a 3-day trip to meet his family in Minnesota and a stop on the way back to be married. Art said he gave up pimping, but he was still running alcohol and was away from Helen for days at a time. When Art was home with Helen, he was on edge, hiding in her personal room and on watch. His alcohol running had cut into someone else's territory, and he was nervous. Helen arranged a plan with him to get out of danger. She gave him most of her cash and sent him to his parents. He left in the middle of the night with a paper bag full of money, and the next morning the police informed Helen of the accident. His car had run off the hill, leaving Art unconscious and pinned under the steering wheel. The money was missing, but a bag full of dope, something even worse than alcohol during Prohibition, was found. Art was arrested for drug trafficking and while in jail hanged himself with rope made from his mattress fabric. Helen was inconsolable, and without her energy the business faltered and was closed. She decided to go back to Chicago, a city that she truly considered home. But on the train ride back, she had a chance meeting with a stranger. After spilling her guts, the man suggested, "Why don't you stop off in Milwaukee and look the town over? It might be a better spot for you than Chicago." It is here where she found the bar that would become the Sunflower Inn. When she walked in, the place was a dive with cracked ceilings and broken plaster. She bought the place from the owner for $300 and kicked everyone out, telling them to come back in a couple of weeks after renovations. Helen reopened the place with daytime hours to avoid the alcohol raids, which tended to only happen at night. With a simple menu including ham, eggs, and potatoes, and a couple of girls upstairs, Helen was back in business. Helen then met a young bartender named Guy. She would talk with him whenever she was in his bar, and one night he invited her to accompany him to a party. He spent the night at her apartment, and when she returned from work the next day, she found that he had moved in. After about a month, Guy quit his job and started bartending for Helen. A few months later, Helen was tipped off by a police officer that they were getting ready to crack down on speakeasies, and their only evidence against Helen was that she was illegally shacked up with Guy. They either needed to get married or break up. Her feelings for Guy weren't the same as they had been for her previous husbands, but they were married. Helen continued turning profits, even removing the girls from her upstairs upon the request of one of her professional baseball player customers so that he could start bringing his teammates. During the whole of Prohibition, she only had a pair of raids. Thanks to a recommendation by her buddy Al Capone, she had a special hidden tank installed to store the booze. On one occasion, Helen received a call from a bartender at another bar that he had just been raided. Helen sounded the alarm to her customers to clean up all the glasses. Within the minute it took for the police to arrive, the evidence was rinsed down the sink. Despite the lack of evidence, the police arrested Guy on suspicion of selling moonshine, but a call to Helen's lawyer got the charges dropped for lack of evidence. On another occasion, a pair of strange drunk couples came into Helen's bar. Helen served them, but she sensed something wasn't right. When she asked where they were from, one of the gentlemen flashed a business card and said he worked for a plumbing business down the street. When they tried to order more drinks, Helen said they were out and had to hold Guy back from saying they had more. When the strangers left, Helen went into cleanup mode to Guy's confusion. They went to bed arguing about the strangers. They were awakened early the next morning by a phone call from a friend at another speakeasy asking if they'd had any strange patrons. The two gentlemen with the girls had been federal agents that had a history of busting speakeasies. In the morning, Guy met with the owner of the plumbing business on the business card and found out that the gentleman that had flashed the business card no longer worked there and was indeed a Fed. Guy and Helen gave the bar a thorough cleaning and had some dry days waiting for the other shoe to drop. And sure enough, 9 days later, they were raided. When all of the investigating was done and nothing was found, Helen called her supplier to fill them up because it would be a long time before she was raided again. Helen liked to spend money, but she also liked to give money and take care of those around her. It was a sticking point between her and Guy that even though she carried a brunt of the work that brought in their money, he didn't approve of her giving it away. One young gentleman that benefited from Helen's generosity was a college student named Joe. When Joe said he was considering dropping out of school because of money and because his enthusiasm just wasn't in his engineering major, Helen gave him a job and encouraged him to practice law. Joe switched to law school and did well, and later he became Wisconsin's Senator Joseph McCarthy. By 1937, Helen and Guy's relationship had worn thin, and eventually she gave him all her money so that he could just leave. It made things tight for her financially, but it was worth it. Helen continued running the Sunflower Inn, serving guests from all walks of life and entertaining troops from World War II and the Korean War. Hours on her feet did a job on her, giving her painful varicose veins. In the early 60s, she underwent a series of costly surgeries, and in her older age she was slower to heal. She fell behind on a loan she had taken out for the surgeries and lost the Sunflower Inn. She went on to work at another bar where she just needed to sit and talk to customers while they bought her drinks. She died on May 21st, 1969. Thanks for watching History's Remnants Tribute to Helen Cromwell. And if you would like to learn more about this fascinating woman, check out her book, Dirty Helen, that was written with the assistance of Robert Doherty. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more interesting history, remember to like this video and follow our channel. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest for more between the video content.